He returned to his grandfather's ranch just to clean up and sell the land. But when he opened the old barn, he saw 2 crates covered with canvas. When he pulled it off, he realized his grandfather had been hiding a terrible secret all his life. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and comment where you're watching this video from. The wind carried the smell of old grass and engine oil as Ethan Marlo drove up the narrow dirt road toward the property he hadn't seen in more than a decade. The mountains of northern Montana rose behind him, blue and cold, the kind of land that stripped a man down to what he really was. The pickup rattled over ruts, its headlights sweeping across weathered fence posts and broken wire, ghosts of what had once been a working ranch. He'd left this place when he was 18, swearing never to come back. But when the lawyer called about his grandfather's death, there hadn't been a choice. Someone had to clear out the old property and settle the estate, and there was no one left but him. By the time he reached the gate, the sun had already dipped below the ridge. The wooden sign that once read Marlo Ranch hung by a single chain, creaking in the wind. He climbed out, boots crunching on frost-hardened dirt, and pushed the gate open. The hinges complained in the silence. Everything felt too still. He'd imagined the ranch would be a ruin, half collapsed, fences down, roof caved in. Instead, it looked strangely preserved, untouched, almost waiting. The barn stood against the dim light, the house beyond it dark but intact, windows glinting faintly in the dusk. He parked beside the porch and shut off the engine. The silence pressed in, not even the sound of crickets, just the soft hiss of wind through dry grass. When he stepped onto the porch, the boards held firm under his weight. He half expected them to groan and crumble, but they didn't. His grandfather, Henry Marlo, had built this house with his own hands 70 years ago, and even in death it still stood like a monument to stubborn endurance. Ethan fished the key out of his jacket pocket, the one the lawyer had mailed him, and fitted into the old lock. It turned smoothly. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine soap and tobacco. It wasn't the smell of decay or disuse. It was too clean, too fresh. Dust motes drifted in the beam of his flashlight, but the surfaces were polished, the floors swept, the table neatly set with a single plate and coffee mug. It looked as if Henry had just stepped outside for a minute and might return any second. A strange unease prickled at Ethan's neck. His grandfather had been dead for over a month. The old man's neighbor, a retired sheriff, had found him collapsed near the woodpile, and yet the house didn't look abandoned. He wandered through the rooms, flashlight gliding over the walls. The same photographs still hung in their places. Henry as a young man in military uniform, his stoic face under the brim of an army cap. A black and white portrait of Ethan's parents, long gone after their car skidded off a mountain road when he was 10, and a smaller picture of himself at 7, holding a trout bigger than his arm, his grandfather's calloused hand gripping his shoulder. He remembered the day that picture was taken, the smell of river water and cedar, and Henry's quiet voice saying, "You've got to know the land, Ethan. It gives what it wants, not what you take from it." Now walking through the house, he could almost hear the echo of that voice again. He found himself in the small study where Henry had kept his ledgers. The desk was covered in neat stacks of paper, old bank statements, a few yellowed letters tied with twine. On the center of the blotter sat a sealed envelope, his name written across it in the careful block letters of a man used to carving words in wood, not writing them on paper. For Ethan when the time comes. He hesitated a moment, then tore it open. Inside was a single sheet, the handwriting shaky but unmistakably his grandfather's. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. There are things I never said, things I couldn't say. Start with the barn, but be sure you want to know what's there. Some truths don't stay buried." He read the words twice, his stomach tightening. The barn. Of course, it had always been locked, and as a kid, he'd been told to stay out. Once, when he'd asked why, Henry had said, "Some places hold memories that aren't yours to carry." He'd thought it was just another of the old man's cryptic lessons. Now he wasn't so sure. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his jacket. The night had grown darker outside, the horizon washed in silver moonlight. The idea of going to the barn in the dark seemed foolish, but curiosity was already tightening its grip on him. He pulled on his gloves and stepped back out into the cold. The wind had picked up. The barn loomed ahead, a black shape against the snow-dusted pasture. The padlock on the doors hung open. That was wrong. He remembered distinctly. Henry had always locked it with a heavy steel clasp. Ethan pushed one of the doors. It groaned and swung inward. The smell hit him immediately, oil, dust, and something older, faintly metallic, like rust and time. He clicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating old farm equipment, coils of rope, a tractor under a tarp. Dust floated like snow in the light. Then he saw them, two long wooden crates in the center of the barn, covered with thick army canvas. They were 6 feet long, maybe more, built from oak planks with iron brackets. The bales of hay around them were clean, too clean, no cobwebs, no mouse droppings. Someone had been here not long ago. He stepped closer. The air felt heavier. The first crate's covering was drawn tight, the corners tucked in with deliberate care. His gloved hand brushed the canvas. It was cold, damp from condensation. He thought of coffins. He swallowed and forced himself to breathe. The second crate sat parallel to the first, slightly smaller, its covering sagging in the middle. On top of it lay a folded tarp, a rusted lantern, and an empty coffee cup streaked with residue. Someone had been drinking here recently. He walked a slow circle around them. The beam of the flashlight trembled slightly as he moved. On the far side of the crates, he noticed boot prints in the dirt large, recent, maybe a few days old. They led toward the back door of the barn, which stood slightly ajar, its latch broken. The cold air seeping through carried the smell of pine needles and distant smoke. Ethan's rational mind told him to turn around, lock the doors, and call the sheriff in the morning. But another part of him, the part that had inherited Henry's stubbornness, refused to leave. Whatever these boxes were, whatever his grandfather had hidden here, it was meant for him to find. The letter had made that clear. He crouched beside the first crate and pulled a corner of the canvas loose. Beneath it lay a smooth wooden lid, fastened by long screws. He brushed away dust with his hand, revealing a carved mark, 2 intersecting lines forming a rough X. The wood smelled faintly of varnish and smoke. He hesitated. Maybe it was just storage, some leftover relic of the war or his grandfather's trapping days. But deep down, he knew better. The wind outside howled, pushing through cracks in the walls. A shutter banged against the siding. He turned, shining the flashlight toward the door, and froze. The barn door that he'd left half open was now wide, swinging in the wind. Beyond it, the yard was empty, but the door of the house stood open, light spilling onto the porch. He could have sworn he'd closed it and locked it behind him. A chill ran through him. He killed the flashlight and listened. The silence was perfect, too perfect. No footsteps, no voice, just the faint creak of wood. He stepped backward, hand brushing against the edge of the crate, the cold grain of the lid grounding him. For a moment he wondered if he'd imagined it, if the draft had simply blown the door wide. But then he heard it, a single deliberate creak of a floorboard from inside the house. He tightened his jaw, took a breath, and looked back at the covered crates. They stood motionless, mute and heavy in the gloom. Whatever lay beneath those tarps had been waiting, just as the note had said, waiting for him to come back. He turned toward the open door, snow swirling in the yard, and started walking back to the house. Each step measured, every instinct screaming that he was no longer alone on the ranch. The wind cut through his jacket, sharp as a warning, and in the pale light of the porch, he saw the front door swing wider, slow and deliberate, as if inviting him in. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, the beam of his flashlight trembling against the doorway. Inside, the lamp on the table flickered, though he had left no light burning. The house, the barn, the untouched order of it all. Nothing felt right anymore. He stood there in the dark, the note still in his pocket, the 2 crates waiting behind him, and for the first time in years, Ethan Marlo felt the old land looking back at him. And then, from deep inside the house, something fell, a soft, heavy sound like a body hitting the floor. He froze. The wind died. The silence that followed was absolute. He stepped onto the porch, hand tightening on the flashlight. Somewhere in the shadows beyond that open door, something waited, just as patiently as the 2 covered crates in the barn. The sound that broke the silence inside the house was small, yet it carried through the walls like a gunshot. Ethan stood motionless in the doorway, his breath held, eyes fixed on the dark interior. For a long moment, there was nothing. No movement, no second noise, only the faint creaking of the beams above as the wind pressed against the roof. He slowly stepped inside, his boots brushing over the wooden floorboards that seemed to shift under his weight. The lamp on the kitchen table flickered once and went out, plunging the room into gray twilight. His own reflection wavered in the dark window, pale and uncertain, a stranger standing in a dead man's house. He told himself it must have been the wind, maybe a book sliding off a shelf or a curtain snapping loose. But the thought didn't settle. He checked the hallway, then the small bedroom, then the pantry. Everything was in perfect order. Too perfect. When he reached the back door, he found it unlocked. He could have sworn he'd bolted it earlier. Ethan turned the key, pushed the heavy wooden beam across the frame, and leaned there for a moment, letting the quiet swallow him. The letter from his grandfather still rested in his jacket pocket, its words echoing in his mind. Start with the barn, but be sure you want to know what's there. He had found the crates, yes, but he hadn't opened them. Not really. Something inside him said that was only the beginning. He went upstairs to the small room that had been his when he was a boy. The bed was made, the quilt folded with military precision, and on the dresser lay a set of keys. One of them was old brass, labeled in faded pencil. Upper room. He frowned because the house didn't have an upstairs apart from the loft. Then he remembered the old ladder behind the barn, the one that led to the storage attic above the workshop. That must be what the key was for. His heart gave a small, uneasy jump. He spent the night turning from side to side, half expecting to hear footsteps outside. Each gust of wind against the walls sounded like breathing, each creak like the house whispering in its sleep. When dawn finally came, the light had a brittle, pale quality, cold as metal. He made coffee on the stove, the smell briefly warming the air, and stood at the window watching mist crawl across the pasture. For the first time, he saw tire marks in the dirt beyond the fence, faint but recent. Someone else had been on the property not long ago. By mid-morning, he was outside again. The frost had melted, leaving dark patches on the ground. The barn door hung open exactly as he had left it, the canvas shapes inside motionless. He didn't go in. Not yet. Instead, he found the ladder propped against the side of the barn, its rungs gray with age. When he climbed it, a small trap door greeted him, locked by a corroded latch that matched the brass key from upstairs. It turned with a reluctant click. Dust fell from the hinge as he pushed it open. The attic was cramped, heavy with the smell of dry wood and old paper. Shafts of light pierced through the slats, illuminating rows of boxes and trunks. In the far corner stood a single wooden chest, bound with 2 leather straps. It looked untouched for decades, yet the air around it felt disturbed, as if someone had recently stood there. Ethan knelt and wiped the dust from the lid. The initials carved into it were clear even through the grime. H.M. Henry Marlo. Inside were bundles of letters, each tied with thin string, their envelopes browned by time. He took one at random. The handwriting was fine and deliberate, almost elegant, definitely not his grandfather's. The date read June 12th, 1958. The letter began without greeting. You promised you'd come back with him alive. I've prayed every night since, but I fear you've made me a liar. If anyone finds out what really happened, they'll take everything from us. Ethan's pulse quickened. He read another. The man from the army came by again. I told him you were sick, that you couldn't talk yet, but he didn't believe me. They will send someone else. Hide what you brought home. Hide it well. He sat back, the letters trembling in his hands. The woman's name was signed at the bottom of each page, Rachel Mercer. He didn't recognize it, but something about the name felt strangely familiar. He looked through more envelopes, noting the years, 1958, 1959, 1961, and the gradual shift in tone from affection to fear. The last letter was dated 1962. If the boy ever asks, tell him nothing. Tell him his father died a hero. It's better that way for both of us. Ethan placed the letter down, feeling the blood drain from his face. The boy? Could she have meant his father? His grandfather had raised his son alone, but the family had always said his grandmother died young, her name barely mentioned. Had that been a lie too? As he sifted through the chest, a small packet fell from between the letters. It was a photograph, grainy and creased. His grandfather stood in uniform beside another, soldier tall, lean, with dark eyes and a grin that didn't quite reach them. The back was marked in Henry's handwriting. Raymond and me, Korea, 1953. Underneath that, someone else had scrawled later in blue ink, "He's still here." Ethan stared at the words until they blurred. Still here. That meant alive or buried. Either way, it pointed back to the crates. The air in the attic seemed to close in around him, the dust stinging his throat. He needed to see what was inside. He descended the ladder slowly, the photograph clutched tight in his hand. Clouds were moving in from the west, dragging shadows across the land. The wind had shifted. It carried the scent of pine smoke, faint but sharp. Someone, somewhere nearby, had lit a fire. He stopped halfway to the barn, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved except the tall grass bending under the wind. Inside the barn, the stillness was thicker than before. Dust motes floated lazily in the beam of light coming through the roof gaps. The crates waited in the same position, undisturbed, except that one of the corners of the canvas on the first had loosened overnight, flapping slightly in the draft. He pulled it back. Beneath it lay the lid of the crate, smooth and pale. He brushed off the dust, revealing something unexpected, a small brass latch, recently polished. Someone had opened it before. He hesitated, then lifted the latch. The lid groaned slightly as he raised it. Inside were old tools, axes, saws, a rusted lantern, a folded army jacket, and a bundle of papers tied together with twine. The papers bore government seals faded to gray. The top page was a casualty report. Operation Iron Ridge. Personnel lost in action. Brigadier Raymond M. Mercer, 12th of June, 1953. He flipped through the rest. All said the same thing. Mercer, missing, presumed dead. At the bottom of the crate lay another object, a metal identification tag, its surface tarnished, the letters just visible. Mercer, Raymond M. Serial OIG 2349. He turned it over and froze. On the back, scratched crudely into the metal, were 3 words. He shot me. The sound of his own heartbeat filled his ears. He stumbled backward, knocking against the second crate. It shifted slightly, the canvas rustling. For a moment, he thought he saw something move beneath it. He backed away, his breath short, and turned toward the open door, needing air. The yard outside shimmered with late sunlight. He tried to steady himself. Maybe it was a joke, some cruel trick left by the old man to keep intruders away. But the letters upstairs, the photograph, the tag, they were too precise to be coincidence. His grandfather hadn't just fought in a war. He'd brought it home with him. Ethan turned to look back at the house. From this distance, he could see the windows glinting, the curtains barely stirring. And yet, in the reflection of the glass, he thought he saw movement, someone standing inside, watching. The figure shifted, then disappeared. He started toward the porch, the ground crunching beneath his boots, when the low hum of an engine broke the quiet. He turned toward the ridge. A black pickup truck had stopped on the dirt road above the pasture. Its headlights were on, though the driver's silhouette was hidden behind the glare. For a few seconds, the truck idled, unmoving. Then, without warning, the headlights went dark. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. The truck didn't leave. It just waited. Ethan's throat tightened. He took a slow step backward, hand instinctively going to the flashlight at his belt. The cold had deepened, and the shadows around the barn seemed to stretch toward him. He looked once more toward the road, but the truck was gone, vanished into the hills without a trace of tire marks. He stood alone in the fading light, the tag clenched in his palm, and realized that whatever his grandfather had buried, someone else already knew he was digging it up. Behind him, the barn doors creaked open just slightly, though no wind blew. A whisper of cold air slipped through the gap, carrying the faint scent of earth and oil, and something that smelled unmistakably like blood. The night fell faster than Ethan expected, swallowing the last of the light as if the mountains themselves had drawn a curtain across the sky. He stood by the barn doors, the faint smell of iron still in his nose, the tag of Raymond Mercer clutched in his palm. The metal felt cold even through his glove. a small and undeniable truth pressing against his skin. His grandfather had killed a man, or at least had been there when a man died, and for the first time Ethan understood that whatever had been hidden on this land wasn't meant for peace. He closed the crate and dropped the latch, but the image of the words scratched into the tag wouldn't leave him. He shot me. Back inside the house, the air felt too heavy, as though the walls remembered every secret they had been forced to contain. Ethan poured himself a drink, something to steady the shaking in his hands. The whiskey was old, sharp, and it burned on the way down. He set the glass beside the note from Henry. "Start with the barn," the note said, but it didn't say stop. He looked toward the window. Beyond the glass, the moon cast a pale ribbon of light across the pasture, and at the far edge of it, just where the land dipped toward the creek, he saw the shape of the old well. He remembered that well from when he was a child, its circular stone lip half buried in weeds, the bucket long gone. Henry had told him to stay away from it. "The water's bad," he used to say, "bitter as a lie." Ethan had never asked what that meant. Now the words carried a weight that made his stomach turn. He waited until dawn to go out there. The air was clear and still, the kind of silence that came only before sunrise. He carried a lantern this time, though he didn't light it until he reached the edge of the well. The stones were cold beneath his hands, slick with frost. He leaned over the edge and shone the light downward. The beam reached maybe 20 feet before vanishing into black water. But something caught the light, a flash of metal, something round, resting against the inner wall just above the surface. Ethan's pulse quickened. He found an old rope and tied it around the handle of a rusted iron hook, lowering it slowly until it clinked against the unseen object. When he drew it up, the rope went taut, heavier than before. He hauled until something broke free with a splash. As he pulled, the lantern's glow fell on a soaked leather coat, old military issue, thick and black with age. The smell that rose from it was foul, like mud mixed with rot. He dropped the coat onto the grass and stepped back. Inside one of the coat's pockets was a small tin box, the kind soldiers used for cigarettes. He pried it open with his knife. Inside were two things: a folded photograph and a child's silver bracelet engraved with the initials RM. The photograph was of Henry and another man, Mercer again, no doubt standing before a tent. But on this one, there was a third person, a young woman, her arm linked through Henry's, a softness in her eyes that cut through time. Rachel Mercer. His grandfather had lied about everything. He sat on the grass staring at the photograph until the cold seeped through his jeans. His grandfather hadn't just hidden the memory of a war. He'd buried the proof of something more intimate, something unforgivable. The bracelet in his hand told a story all its own. A child, maybe Mercer's, maybe Henry's. The lines between guilt and love blurred until they were indistinguishable. A low rumble pulled him back to the present. He looked up, expecting thunder, but the sky was clear. The sound came from farther down the valley, the slow growl of an engine. Ethan rose and wiped his hands on his jacket. A few seconds later, the noise stopped. When he looked toward the road that curved through the hills, there was nothing. No dust, no headlights. But when he turned back toward the house, he saw tracks in the mud that hadn't been there the day before. Broad, fresh tire marks leading from the gate straight to the barn and back out again. Someone had been here in the night. He ran to the barn, the rope from the well still clutched in one hand. The doors were ajar, the wood splintered where the latch had been forced. Inside, the air was colder than before. His breath misted in front of him as he looked around. The canvas coverings were gone from the crates. The first one stood open, the contents scattered across the floor: papers, clothes, fragments of old wood. But the second crate had changed completely. The lid was shifted, as though someone had started to pry it loose. He moved closer. The smell hit him first, thick and unmistakable. Rot, deep and old. His stomach turned as he pulled the lid away. Inside lay what he had dreaded finding, a body, or what was left of one. The bones were arranged neatly, wrapped in the remnants of a military blanket. The skull rested on top of folded fabric, and on the breastbone, darkened by time, lay another identification tag. Mercer, Raymond M. For a long moment, Ethan couldn't move. The truth, all of it, was laid bare before him. Henry had brought his friend home, buried him here, and built the ranch's walls around the silence. But there was something else in the crate too, a slip of paper. Yellowed but intact, tucked between the folds of cloth. He picked it up carefully. The ink was smudged but legible. He said it was an accident, but I saw him pull the trigger. The air seemed to vanish from the barn. Ethan stumbled backward, clutching the note. Someone else had written this. Someone who had been there. Rachel, maybe. Or another witness. If this was true, then his grandfather wasn't just a deserter or a coward. He was a murderer. The sound of gravel crunching outside froze him in place. Someone was walking toward the barn. The steps were slow, deliberate, heavy enough to make the boards creak underfoot. Ethan's heart pounded in his ears. He turned off the lantern and crouched behind the crates, holding his breath. The footsteps stopped at the threshold. A shadow fell across the floorboards. Then a voice low, rough and calm. "You shouldn't have opened them, son." Ethan felt a surge of cold run through him. The voice was unfamiliar but carried something unsettling, something that didn't belong to a stranger. He stayed still, his fingers tightening around the flashlight like a weapon. The door creaked wider. The stranger stepped inside, his silhouette framed by the gray morning light. He was tall, wearing a coat that looked too new for this place, a hat pulled low over his eyes. "I said you shouldn't have opened them," the man repeated. "Some things ought to stay where they were put." Ethan rose slowly, the lantern swinging in his hand. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer. His gaze drifted to the open crate. For a moment his jaw tightened, and something like grief flickered across his face. And then he turned his eyes back to Ethan. "You've done enough damage already." Before Ethan could respond, the man backed toward the door. "Leave it alone," he said quietly, almost kindly. "You've no idea what it cost to bury this." Then he was gone. The barn door swung shut behind him, and the sound of his footsteps faded into the wind. Ethan ran outside, but the yard was empty. No truck, no fresh tire marks this time. The man had vanished as quickly as he'd appeared. He stood there staring at the horizon, trying to breathe. Whoever that was, he knew the story, maybe even lived it. The ground beneath Ethan's feet felt suddenly unsteady, as though the land itself was shifting with all the secrets buried beneath it. When he finally went back inside the house, the room felt colder than before. On the kitchen table lay something new, a folded piece of paper that hadn't been there when he left. The handwriting was unfamiliar, hurried. "Stop digging. The next thing you find will kill you too." Ethan looked up, heart hammering, but the yard beyond the window was still and empty. The note trembled in his hands. Somewhere outside, a raven called once, its voice carrying over the field like a warning. He turned toward the barn again, where the crates waited in silence, and knew that whatever had started when he opened them would not end until he uncovered the last secret his grandfather had left behind. The morning came in gray light, and with it, a stillness that felt like the world holding its breath. Ethan hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the pale curve of the skull in the crate, the hollow socket staring up through folds of rotted fabric. The image of that stranger's silhouette in the doorway, the calm, quiet warning, wouldn't leave his mind. He sat at the kitchen table, the note the man had left lying in front of him. "Stop digging. The next thing you find will kill you too." He had read it a dozen times, searching for some clue, a name, a reason, anything, but there was nothing. Just those words written in haste and anger. The coffee on the stove had gone cold. He poured it down the sink and stood for a moment by the window. Outside, the sky was the color of steel, and the wind carried a low moan through the open fields. The ranch looked deserted, but Ethan knew it wasn't. Someone else had been moving here, someone who knew this place as well as he did. The thought made his chest tighten. If the man from last night had been telling the truth, then maybe this wasn't over a family secret at all. Maybe it was something darker, something that stretched further back than his own name. He forced himself to go back to the barn. The doors groaned when he pushed them open, the cold inside biting at his face. Dust drifted in thin threads through the light coming from a gap in the roof. The crates waited where he had left them, but the air around them felt charged, as if the space itself remembered violence. He approached the open one, the one with the remains, and crouched down. The bones were arranged with a strange care, as though his grandfather had tried to restore order after the chaos of death. Henry had not been a careless man. If he had done this, he had done it out of guilt, not madness. Ethan lifted the old army blanket aside and found more than bones. Beneath the rib cage, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small bundle. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a rusted revolver, its grip worn smooth with age, and beneath it, a folded letter sealed in wax. His fingers trembled as he broke the seal. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the writing was unmistakable, his grandfather's hand. If you are reading this, then the past has found its way back. Raymond Mercer was my friend. He trusted me, and I betrayed him. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. There was an accident, a fight, a bullet meant for no one. But the lie that followed was mine. I brought him home to bury him because I couldn't bear for the world to call him a traitor. I thought if I carried the blame in silence, it might be enough. I was wrong. The letter went on, words scrawled more frantically near the end. There was someone else there. She saw everything. I made her promise never to speak of it. I thought I was protecting her, but I was only protecting myself. If she ever came back here, it was for him, not for me. Don't look for her, Ethan. She doesn't forgive. Ethan let the letter fall to his side. The edges of the words seemed to blur. She, the woman from the photographs, Rachel Mercer, his grandfather's lover, and the wife of the man in the box. The reality settled over him like a physical weight. The child she wrote about, the one she said must never know the truth. Could it have been his father? He thought of the silver bracelet he had found at the well, the initials RM. Maybe it hadn't belonged to Raymond Mercer at all. Maybe it had belonged to Rachel's son. A creak from behind made him turn sharply, his pulse spiking. The barn door had swung open a few inches. He waited, listening, but no one came in. He moved quietly to the threshold and looked out across the yard. The wind had picked up, scattering dry leaves across the dirt. Near the fence, something glinted in the grass. He crossed the yard and knelt. It was a set of footprints, heavy, booted, and beside them, the faint tracks of a vehicle's tires. Whoever had been here last night had returned, perhaps even while he slept. He followed the tracks as far as the gate, but they vanished on the hard road beyond. When he turned back, he saw the shape of the barn behind him, squat and dark, and something inside him shifted. This land, this family name, was a graveyard of half-truths. Every step he took only pulled him deeper. Still, he couldn't stop. That evening, as the sun sank behind the ridge, he brought a lantern into the barn and sat beside the crates, the letter in his lap. The silence pressed close, the light flickering over the rough wood and the outlines of the remains. He tried to picture the man his grandfather had been: a soldier, a husband, a liar, and wondered what kind of guilt could drive a man to live out his days surrounded by the evidence of his own sins. He thought of his own father, the man he had barely known, and realized with a start that Henry had probably raised that boy under the same roof where the bones of his real father lay hidden. The thought made him sick. He stood abruptly, pacing the length of the barn. Every board creaked in rhythm with his heartbeat. That was when he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Near the back wall, half buried in dust, was an old wooden trunk. It was smaller than the crates, its lid warped but locked with a simple clasp. He pried it open with his knife. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them, his grandfather through the years, soldiers in uniform, and faces of people Ethan didn't recognize. In one photo, Rachel stood in front of the ranch house, younger but unmistakable. A child stood beside her, maybe 3 years old, with light hair and Henry's eyes. On the back, written in his grandfather's steady script, were the words, "My son." Ethan sat down heavily. The truth hit him all at once. The man who had raised his father was not his real grandfather. Henry Marlo had hidden that fact too, creating a legacy built on a stolen life. Raymond Mercer had died by his hand, and Rachel's child, the one born from that betrayal, was the root of Ethan's own family. He was part of the lie. The lantern flickered. He became aware of the sound of gravel again, faint but clear. This time it wasn't an engine. It was footsteps, slow, steady, approaching from the direction of the house. Ethan blew out the lantern and waited, the darkness swallowing him. The footsteps entered the barn and stopped near the crates. He could hear the faint rasp of breathing. "You've come far enough," a voice said. It was the same one from the night before, calm but sharper now. "You don't know what you're touching." Ethan rose, his hands clenched. "Who are you?" The man stepped closer. In the dim light from the door, Ethan could see his face for the first time, lined, weathered but not old. His eyes were pale like his own. "You really don't see it, do you?" the stranger said quietly. "You and I are the same blood." The words hit him harder than any blow. Ethan stared, unable to speak. "I came here to finish what he started," the man continued. "To bury it all again. But you've made that impossible." He looked toward the open crate. "You should never have dug it up." "Who are you?" Ethan whispered again. The man's expression didn't change. "Rachel Mercer was my mother," he said, "and Henry Marlo was my father." The truth shattered what little balance Ethan had left. This man, this stranger, was his uncle, the secret child hidden in the letters, the proof of everything Henry had tried to erase. The man looked down at the bones in the crate, his jaw tightening. "He told me he'd make it right," he said. "He never did." "What do you want?" Ethan asked. "To take him back where he belongs," the man said simply, "and to make sure no one ever knows what really happened here." Ethan stepped between him and the crate. "I can't let you do that." The man's gaze was cold, almost pitying. "Then you're going to regret coming home." They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the past between them like a living thing. Then the man turned and walked out into the night. Ethan followed to the door, but the darkness beyond was empty again. Only the wind remained, whispering across the fields. When he went back inside, the lantern had burned low. The crate stood open, the letter still where he had dropped it. Everything was as before, except that on the edge of the wooden lid, fresh fingerprints gleamed in the lantern light. The man had touched the bones before leaving. Ethan sank to his knees, exhausted, the words of his grandfather's letter echoing in his mind. "Don't look for her. She doesn't forgive." Now he understood. It wasn't only Rachel who refused to forgive. It was the past itself, and it was still walking his land. Ethan didn't sleep that night. The words of the stranger echoed in his skull, circling endlessly, refusing to fade. "Rachel Mercer was my mother, and Henry Marlo was my father." That voice, calm but burning with resentment, haunted every corner of his mind. He sat by the window until dawn, watching the pale light crawl over the fields. The barn stood in the distance, unmoving and dark, yet it felt alive, as though the ground beneath it pulsed with something restless, unfinished. Somewhere between the bones in that crate and the man who claimed to share his blood, the truth had stopped being about history. It had become personal. When the first light reached the porch, Ethan walked outside. Frost clung to the grass, glittering under the sun. His breath came in faint clouds. The air was sharp, too clean, as if mocking the rot and secrets buried under it. He went to the barn, half expecting to find it empty again, half afraid of what he might see. The door stood slightly open, rocking gently in the wind. Inside, everything was still, but something was different. The letter he had found the day before was gone. So was the revolver. He froze, scanning the ground. There were boot prints in the dirt fresh, the same as before. The man, his uncle, had been here again during the night. Maybe he had taken what he needed. Maybe he had come to make sure the past stayed buried. Either way, it meant he wasn't finished. Neither was Ethan. He stepped closer to the crates. The air inside was heavy with the smell of dust and old oil. The skull in the box seemed to look at him, its empty eyes daring him to act. He thought about calling the sheriff, about letting someone else deal with it. But he knew how it would look. A dead man's confession, an unmarked grave, a stranger claiming blood ties. No one would believe him, and deep down he didn't want them to. The truth of this place was his alone now. It belonged to him just as much as the guilt did. He turned to leave, but something caught his attention near the back wall, a piece of paper pinned under a nail. It hadn't been there before. He pulled it free and read the short message written in a hand he recognized. "Meet me by the creek before sunset. We finish this tonight." There was no signature. He didn't need one. All day he felt the weight of that message pressing on him. He tried to work to fix the old fence, to occupy his hands, but his mind kept returning to the photograph of the child, to the letter confessing murder, to the body in the crate. The land around him seemed different now, as if the soil itself carried the memory of betrayal. The old well shimmered in the corner of his vision, its stones dark with moisture. He wondered if the water below still held the scent of leather and metal, of the things he'd pulled from its depths. As the sun began to sink, he walked toward the creek. The path was one he remembered from boyhood, winding through the thickets where his grandfather used to hunt. The trees stood bare now, their branches like black veins against the orange sky. He carried the lantern from the barn in the silver bracelet he had found in the coat pocket. It felt right to bring it, though he wasn't sure why. The creek lay half frozen, its surface a patchwork of ice and moving water. On the far bank stood the man. He looked older in the fading light, his features carved in stone, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. Ethan stopped a few feet away, his breath visible between them. "I didn't think you'd come," the man said quietly. "You left me no choice," Ethan answered. The man's gaze flicked toward the bracelet in Ethan's hand. "You found her things." "I found everything," Ethan said. "The letters, the body, the gun. You knew what he did." The man's expression didn't change. "He told me before he died, every word of it. He thought he could confess and find peace. But peace doesn't come that easy." "Why didn't you go to the police?" "Because it wouldn't have changed anything. My mother's name was already mud. My father's, your grandfather's, was a lie. I thought if I kept it buried, maybe I could save what was left of him." Ethan shook his head. "You came here to make sure no one ever found out. You threatened me." "I warned you," the man said. "There's a difference." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft rush of water under the ice. The light dimmed further, the first stars flickering in the darkening sky. "You came back for the gun," Ethan said at last. "What are you planning to do with it?" The man's eyes narrowed. "Finish what he couldn't." Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "You mean me?" The man didn't deny it. "You opened the door. Now the only way to close it is to burn the whole house down." He took a slow step forward, and the dim outline of the revolver gleamed at his side. Ethan's pulse quickened. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," the man said. "You don't understand what it means to live under another man's sin, to carry it like your own." "I do," Ethan said softly. "I'm living it now." For a moment, neither moved. Then the man's hand twitched toward his coat. Ethan lunged, knocking the arm aside. The gun went off, the sound ripping through the valley. A flock of birds exploded from the trees, their cries scattering into the dusk. They struggled in the mud, grappling for control. Ethan felt the heat of the barrel near his face, smelled the gunpowder. He grabbed the man's wrist, forcing it down, and the revolver fired again, the bullets shattering ice at their feet. When it was over, the world seemed to tilt. The man stumbled backward, his eyes wide, the gun slipping from his fingers. He fell hard onto the bank, one hand pressed against his chest where the blood was already spreading. The red soaked quickly through his coat, dark against the gray. Ethan dropped to his knees beside him, his breath ragged. "I didn't mean to." The man's mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile. "That's what he said too," he whispered, voice breaking into a cough. "History doesn't forget, Ethan. It just waits." And then he was still. For a long time, Ethan couldn't move. The only sound was the creek murmuring over the stones, as if indifferent to what had just happened. He looked down at the gun, at the body, and felt the circle closing. His grandfather had killed a man to bury a truth. Now Ethan had done the same without meaning to. When he finally rose, the stars had sharpened above him, clear and cold. He dragged the man's body to the edge of the field, where the earth was soft, and began to dig with his bare hands. The work was slow, brutal, but it kept him from thinking. When it was done, he covered the grave with branches and dirt, marking it with nothing. He walked back to the barn under a sky washed in silver light. Inside, the crates waited, silent witnesses to another death. He stared at them a long time before pulling a match from his pocket. The flame trembled in his fingers. For a moment, he thought of burning at all the bones, the letters, the lies. But he couldn't. Destruction wouldn't free him. It hadn't freed Henry. He blew out the match and stood in the dark. Somewhere in the rafters, an owl hooted once and went quiet. The smell of smoke lingered in his memory, though no fire burned. He sat on the cold ground, his hands stained with earth and blood, and whispered to the empty air. "It's over," he said. But even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't. Not really, because some truths didn't die. They only changed hands. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and wet soil. Ethan looked toward the horizon, where the faint outline of dawn was beginning to break. The ranch lay silent, but beneath that silence was a pulse, steady, deep, like a heartbeat coming from underground. The land remembered, even if he tried to forget. The morning after the shooting came cold and silent, as though the world itself had stopped breathing. Ethan sat at the edge of his bed, staring at his hands. The blood had washed away hours ago, but he could still feel it clinging to his skin, beneath the nails, deep in the lines of his palms. He had slept for perhaps an hour, no more. The rest of the night had been filled with the echo of the gunshot, the man's final words repeating like a curse. "History doesn't forget, Ethan. It just waits." The sun had barely risen when he walked out to the barn again. The ground was stiff with frost, crunching under his boots. He moved like someone trapped between waking and a dream. Inside, the air was dry, and dust hung thick in the beams of light cutting through the roof slats. The crates remained where they always had, silent witnesses to everything. He stood before them, hands in his pockets, and whispered a name he hadn't spoken aloud before. Henry Marlo. His grandfather's name sounded different now. It no longer carried the weight of pride or memory, only of guilt and unfinished confessions. He pulled the second crate, the one that had once held the bones, into the center of the floor. The boards beneath it groaned in protest. Something inside him wanted to destroy it all, to tear away the last physical remnants of this family curse. But another part, the quieter part, understood that destruction wouldn't bring peace. Burning the truth didn't make it vanish, it only buried it deeper. He crouched down and pressed his hand against the lid. "You built your whole life on this," he said softly, "and now it's mine." The sound of wind scraped against the sides of the barn, carrying the smell of snow. It would fall soon, the first of the season. The land around him would change, become clean and white, but only on the surface. Beneath, everything rotten would still be there, frozen and waiting. He walked to the workbench and found an old box of matches. The thought of lighting one, of setting flame to the crates, came to him again. Yet as his fingers brushed the rough heads of the matches, he hesitated. His grandfather's letter was still in his pocket, crumpled but intact. He unfolded it, reading the last lines once more. "I thought silence would save us. I see now it only made the ghosts louder." He closed his eyes and struck a match. The small flame flared, trembling in the cold air. For a long moment he watched it dance, reflected in the dull brass of the revolver lying nearby. Then he blew it out. The smoke curled upward and vanished. He left the barn and crossed the yard toward the old well. The snow had begun to fall, slow flakes drifting through the air. The stones of the well glistened, the rope he'd used days ago still coiled neatly at its base. He stood there for a while, listening to the faint whisper of water below. Somewhere down there was the place where the past had first begun to rise, where he had pulled from the dark not just a coat and a bracelet, but a legacy of deceit. He took the revolver from his pocket and stared at it. The gun had been the beginning and the end of everything. His grandfather had used one like it to end a man's life. Now it had claimed another. He dropped it into the well. The sound it made when it hit the water was small, final like a closing door. Inside the house, the air was colder than before. He lit the stove, its crackle the only sign of life. On the table lay another envelope he hadn't noticed when he came in, its edges slightly curled from the damp. His heart sank as he recognized the handwriting. It was Henry's again. The envelope must have been hidden somewhere in the house, dislodged by time or by the cold. He tore it open with shaking fingers. "Ethan," it began, "if you ever find this, it means the land has chosen to give you the rest of the story. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect understanding. But you deserve to know the truth. The night Raymond died, it wasn't just anger that pulled the trigger, it was fear. He had found out about Rachel and the child. He meant to take them and leave, to tell the world what I'd done. I begged him not to. He laughed, and I shot him. There's no redemption for that. I tried to make peace with it by keeping his body close, by pretending he was only sleeping under my care. But every night I heard him. I heard his voice in the wind, in the boards of this house, in the creak of the barn door. That's why I could never leave. I stayed here to keep him company. Ethan folded the letter and pressed it to his chest. It was strange. The confession didn't change anything, but somehow it made the silence heavier, more real. The sins of the dead had settled fully on his shoulders now, and there was nowhere left to run. As evening came, he stepped outside again. The snow had thickened, covering the footprints and the blood, smoothing the earth until it looked untouched. The sky was low and gray, the horizon swallowed by the storm. He could hear the faint creak of the windmill turning slowly above the well, and beyond it, the sound of the creek beneath its crust of ice. Somewhere in that sound was the voice of the land, whispering what it always had. Remember. He gathered what he could, the papers, the letters, the remaining photographs, and carried them out to the old oak that stood near the edge of the pasture. There he built a small fire, just large enough to burn the evidence without lighting the snow. The pages curled and blackened one by one, words disappearing into smoke. When the last photograph crumbled, he felt something ease inside him. Not peace exactly, but acceptance. The truth had been told. The past had had its say. When he returned to the house, he found the key to the barn on the kitchen table. He didn't remember leaving it there. It gleamed faintly in the firelight, as though inviting him to lock everything behind him one final time. He took it and walked back through the snow. The barn door resisted slightly before closing, and he turned the key in the heavy lock. The sound was deep, resonant. He nailed a small board across the doors, using one of Henry's old tools. On it, with the back of a nail, he scratched a few simple words. Do not open. The truth rests here. Then he turned and walked away. The snow swallowed his footprints as quickly as he made them. The house looked small against the white fields, the windows dark except for the faint glow of the stove. He paused at the gate and looked back once, the wind lifting the snow around him in slow spirals. He didn't know what he would do next or where he would go. Maybe he would sell the land, maybe he wouldn't. It no longer mattered. What mattered was that the ghosts had names now, and those names were his inheritance. He climbed into his truck and started the engine. As the tires crunched over the frozen road, he felt something strange, a hollow sort of relief, the kind that comes when a wound finally stops bleeding, even if it never fully heals. In the mirror, the barn grew smaller until it was nothing more than a shadow against the snow. He thought of Henry, of Rachel, of Raymond Mercer, of the man he had buried by the creek, blood of his own blood. He thought of all the lives that had ended here, each one trying to bury a truth the land refused to keep quiet. And as the road curved away from the ranch, he whispered a single line to the wind. Let it end here. The wind did not answer. It never did. But as he drove toward the horizon, the storm began to break. A thin streak of light cut through the clouds, falling across the fields like a promise that somewhere, beyond the reach of guilt and memory, something clean still waited. When the ranch disappeared behind him, only the snow remained, and beneath it, the earth kept its silence once more. Though deep under that silence, something continued to stir, as if the land itself was still remembering, and perhaps it always would. If you want to know what happens next, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. New stories are coming soon. Don't leave without watching the other videos on this channel. Each one hides a truth you won't forget. And share this video with someone who loves dark secrets buried in the past.